So, in this video, we're going to look at the characteristics of developing countries. Now, it's important to point out that this is a bit of a generalization. Many developing countries vary hugely in terms of their characteristics. Each is individual. However, if we were to generalize, we'd point to these things as a characteristic of a low-income country. First of all, of course, not surprisingly, we have low income per capita, so GMP per capita tends to be right at the bottom. And this is obviously reflected in a low standard of living by the narrow measure of standard of living. And it's reflected in very low levels of productivity, hence the importance of productivity. Secondly, we often have very poor infrastructure. So what is infrastructure? It's basically physical assets that are owned by the private and public sector that enhance economic activity of firms and households. So obviously roads, rail, bridges, tunnels, telecommunications, utilities such as water supply and electricity supplies are absolutely vital to the functioning of a modern, efficient economy. And if you look at many developing countries, then you tend to find very poor infrastructure, such as unreliable energy supplies, where firms and households might have power for only certain times of the day. You find very poor transport systems, very poor road conditions, for example, where it takes hours maybe to travel 60 or 80 miles. And of course, with that, there's going to be a problem for firms in terms of producing goods and services, and is likely to lead to a lower level of foreign direct investment. And it's certainly going to hamper productivity. So infrastructure is vital. And another problem, another characteristic, is low levels of human capital, particularly high levels of illiteracy rates, school attendance, certainly far from 100%. In some countries, because of some conservative attitudes, girls and women are left out in terms of education. Reading ages are low, writing ability and numeracy are problematic. And of course, this all leads to lower levels of productivity. Improving female education is often seen as a key measure and a key effective tool of development. Anyhow, moving on from human capital, we've got primary product dependence is a problem. Because if you have a poor country, you have a large agrarian sector, making up maybe 2/3, 3/4 of output. This is often low value added. So if a country produces something like coffee or tea, the value added often occurs in a Western country or a rich country, such as the coffee. The beans are bought on the open market, by tailors of Harrogate, and then they're converted into highly valuable product, decent coffee. So the value added is often very low. And of course, the other problem with primary product dependence is the high volatility and fluctuation in world prices within world markets. And of course, they also make a big percentage of the country's exports. Zambia exports a colossal amount of copper as a proportion of its balance of payments. And of course, this makes the country yet more vulnerable to shocks in world markets for primary products. And of course, you go through this transition. So middle-income countries tend to have a large manufacturing sector, whereas high-income countries tend to have a large service sector and a really small agricultural sector, maybe 3 or 4% of GDP, while services are 70–80% of GDP in a country like the UK or the USA. So going through this transition is part of development, and a large primary product dependence is a characteristic of many developing countries. Again, we don't want to generalise. And then it comes to health. Now, unfortunately, health outcomes, life expectancy, infant mortality is relatively high, although it's improved a great deal in the last few decades. Among very poor countries, the levels of infant mortality and the life expectancy are rather poor. Clean water and sanitation is a problem, and the number of doctors as part of a population tends to be very low. So a lot of preventable illnesses in a rich country are a real problem, such as AIDS, Ebola, malaria, cholera, easily preventable, and sadly people die from those diseases. So health, of course, if related this to GDP, it obviously affects productivity, as does education and the level of human capital. And that brings us to population growth. On the whole, in poor countries, they haven't gone through this demographic transition. So whilst the mortality rate comes down, because of improved health, the birth rate remains relatively high, and you get a huge population expansion and a young age structure in the population, which tends to be a characteristic of developing countries. And so parents regard children as vital workers in terms of agricultural output, and of course as providers for some kind of care and help in old age. So, because unemployment and underemployment might be something else we could mention. Okay, so these are, broadly speaking, what you might call the characteristics of low-income countries, of developing countries. Thank you for watching.